In the halls of ancient power, a deadly lesson unfolds. People would rather tolerate false praise than sincere critics. Callisthenes, the brilliant student of Aristotle, was chosen for what seemed an honor, to serve as philosophical companion to Alexander the Great, conqueror of nations. Despite his teacher's warnings to choose his words carefully, Callisthenes believed in the naked truth. His fatal mistake? Assuming that Alexander's professed love of learning meant he welcomed honest criticism. At first, all went well between the philosopher and the king. Intellectual discussions flourished, and Callisthenes felt valued for his mind. But as Alexander's military campaign intensified, so did the conqueror's ego. Where once stood a student eager for wisdom, now loomed a man who saw himself as divine, beyond question or critique. When Callisthenes spoke his mind one too many times, the consequences were swift and merciless. Alexander, the supposed lover of truth, could not bear to hear he was wrong. The philosopher paid with his life, a brutal reminder that power rarely tolerates genuine criticism, no matter how virtuous its wielder claims to be. This ancient tragedy echoes through history into our modern workplaces and relationships, warning against the dangers of unbridled honesty with those above us. Before we start the video, buckle up, get ready, and subscribe for a special surprise. Honesty is a fool's game. This truth, bitter and pragmatic, has echoed across centuries of human history, yet each generation seems destined to learn it anew through blood and tears. In the ancient world, where philosophy and power intertwined in complex ways, one man's commitment to truth would test this maxim in the most definitive and fatal manner possible. The Macedonia of Philip II had risen from a peripheral kingdom to the dominant force in the Greek world, and his son Alexander had inherited not only his father's military genius, but also a deep intellectual curiosity. This curiosity had been carefully cultivated by Alexander's tutor, the great philosopher Aristotle, who had spent formative years shaping the prince's mind. Their relationship had been close, with the young Alexander absorbing the philosopher's teachings on ethics, politics, and natural science with remarkable aptitude. But power changes men. As Alexander embarked on his legendary military campaigns, conquering vast territories and transforming himself from a Macedonian king to an emperor of unprecedented reach, the distance between him and his former teacher grew. Physical distance was merely the beginning. A philosophical gulf was forming as well. The teachings of moderation, reflection, and ethical consideration that Aristotle had instilled began to fade against the intoxicating reality of near unlimited power. It was during the Persian campaign when Alexander, perhaps feeling the absence of intellectual challenge among his generals and sycophants, sent a message to his former teacher. The letter carried a complaint that surprised and concerned Aristotle. Alexander, conqueror of nations, admitted to a profound loneliness of the mind. Despite being surrounded by military brilliance and administrative talent, he had no one with whom he could engage in philosophical discourse, no one to challenge his thinking, to discuss the nature of virtue, justice, and truth, subjects that had once consumed his youthful imagination under Aristotle's guidance. The letter presented Aristotle with both an opportunity and a dilemma. Here was a chance to re-establish philosophical influence over the most powerful man in the world, potentially guiding his decisions toward wisdom rather than mere conquest. Yet Aristotle, with his keen understanding of human nature, recognized the danger. Alexander was no longer his student, but a man whose word meant life or death across 3 continents. The wrong philosophical guidance, or more precisely, the right philosophical guidance delivered in the wrong way, could prove disastrous. After careful consideration, Aristotle decided to send his most promising student, Callisthenes, to fulfill Alexander's request. Callisthenes was an exceptional thinker, renowned for his sharp intellect and eloquent expression of complex ideas. He was also Aristotle's nephew, which gave him a family connection that might provide some measure of protection in the volatile environment of Alexander's court. Most importantly, he possessed the intellectual depth to engage meaningfully with Alexander on philosophical matters. Before Callisthenes departed for Alexander's camp, Aristotle requested a private conversation with his protégé. They walked together among the colonnades of the Lyceum, the philosophical school Aristotle had established in Athens. The morning light cast long shadows across the stone paths as Aristotle delivered what would prove to be the most crucial advice of Callisthenes' life, advice that, tragically, would go unheeded. "You are going to serve a man who believes himself becoming a god," Aristotle told his student. "Remember that when you speak with him. Choose your words with care. The truth must sometimes be approached indirectly, like looking at the sun through water, rather than staring directly into its blinding light." Callisthenes listened respectfully, but with inner reservation. This guidance struck him as contrary to the philosophical principles he had absorbed during his years at the Lyceum. Were philosophers not committed to speaking the naked truth? Was intellectual integrity not the foundation of wisdom? The idea that he should temper or disguise his thoughts to accommodate Alexander's ego seemed a betrayal of everything philosophy represented. "Master," Callisthenes responded, "if Alexander truly loves learning as you have taught him to do, surely he will welcome honest discourse. What value is there in a philosophical companion who merely echoes what the king wishes to hear?" Aristotle's expression grew grave. "There is a difference between honesty and tactlessness, between truth and provocation. Alexander is no longer the boy who sat at my feet eager for knowledge. He now sits on a throne higher than any in history, surrounded by those who tell him he can do no wrong. Power of that magnitude changes the way a man hears criticism." But Callisthenes, in his idealistic conviction, could not fully accept this warning. He believed in the transformative power of philosophical truth and in Alexander's genuine intellectual curiosity. If the conqueror truly desired philosophical companionship, then surely he would value sincere engagement over flattery. With this belief firmly anchored in his mind, Callisthenes departed for Alexander's camp, carrying with him both Aristotle's recommendation and his unspoken concern. The journey to join Alexander's expedition was long and arduous. Alexander's forces had pushed far into Asia, beyond territories known to most Greeks. When Callisthenes finally arrived at the military encampment, he found it buzzing with the energy of an enterprise that had transcended mere conquest to become a cultural mission, the Hellenization of the known world. Alexander welcomed Aristotle's emissary warmly, perhaps genuinely gladdened by the prospect of philosophical conversation amidst the consuming demands of empire building. Their initial meetings exceeded Callisthenes' expectations. Alexander displayed the keen intellect that Aristotle had cultivated, engaging enthusiastically in discussions of ethics, metaphysics, and political theory. He questioned assumptions, proposed counter-arguments, and demonstrated a breadth of knowledge that impressed even Callisthenes, who had come prepared to find a military man with fading intellectual interests. During these early exchanges, Callisthenes began to document Alexander's campaigns, taking on the role of court historian in addition to philosophical companion. His accounts were thorough and largely favorable. There was, after all, much to admire in Alexander's strategic brilliance and cultural vision. When Alexander decided to establish libraries and centers of learning in conquered territories, Callisthenes saw evidence that the conqueror retained genuine reverence for knowledge. For a time, it seemed Aristotle's warning had been unnecessary. Alexander appeared to welcome Callisthenes' perspectives, even when they diverged from his own. They debated the ethics of conquest, the nature of rulership, and the proper relationship between Greeks and the barbarian peoples Alexander was incorporating into his empire. While these conversations sometimes grew heated, they remained within the bounds of respectful discourse. Callisthenes began to feel comfortable in his role. He was valued for his mind rather than his capacity for flattery. He formed friendships with some of Alexander's generals, particularly those who, like Ptolemy, shared intellectual interests beyond military matters. He wrote letters back to Aristotle expressing cautious optimism about his influence on the king's thinking. In one such letter, he wrote, "The conquest of territory continues apace, but I detect a growing interest in how these lands might be governed justly rather than merely controlled through force. Perhaps philosophy may yet temper ambition." Aristotle's reply was measured. "Be glad of any positive influence you may have, but remember that a king's ear is most receptive when his glory is being served. Wisdom that challenges his conception of himself will find a less welcome reception." The warning again seemed excessive to Callisthenes. He had witnessed Alexander's genuine engagement with difficult ideas. He had seen the king modify approaches to governance based on philosophical principles they had discussed. What Callisthenes failed to recognize was the carefully preserved distance he had maintained, until then, from the most sensitive subject of all, Alexander himself. As the campaign progressed deeper into Asia, subtle changes began to manifest in Alexander's court. The king, who had once presented himself as first among equals with his Macedonian companions, began adopting elements of Persian royal custom. He dressed in Persian royal garments on certain occasions. He incorporated Persian nobles into his inner circle. Most significantly, his tolerance for contradiction, never his most prominent quality, began to diminish. The first sign of trouble came during a debate about the planned structure of cities Alexander was establishing throughout his conquered territories. Callisthenes advocated for designs that would promote the Greek ideal of the polis, centers where citizens could engage in political self-determination. Alexander, increasingly drawn to Persian models of centralized authority, favored layouts that emphasized imperial grandeur and administrative control. "A king should build monuments to lasting glory," Alexander declared, gesturing to architectural plans that featured grand boulevards leading to imposing palaces. "The greatest monument a ruler can build is a just society where wisdom flourishes," Callisthenes countered. "Athens is remembered not for palaces, but for the ideas born in its humble agora." A momentary flash of irritation crossed Alexander's face, quickly controlled, but noticed by those who knew him well. He did not pursue the argument further that day, but in subsequent city foundations, the Persian influence predominated over Greek democratic principles. It was a small defeat for Callisthenes, but a harbinger of the changing dynamic. More concerning was Alexander's growing comfort with expressions of his own divinity. Egyptian priests at the oracle of Siwa had addressed him as the son of Amun, whom Greeks identified with Zeus, and Alexander had embraced this divine association with increasing conviction. When Callisthenes gently questioned the philosophical implications of a mortal claiming divine status, Alexander's response was cool. "Philosophy must evolve to accommodate new realities," Alexander said. "The union of East and West requires new conceptions of rulership that transcend old Greek limitations." The pressure on Callisthenes intensified as Alexander's campaign pushed into the harsh landscapes of what is now Afghanistan and parts of India. Military challenges mounted, and Alexander's temper, always volatile, became less predictable. The king who had welcomed philosophical discourse now had less time and patience for it. When he did engage, he increasingly expected agreement rather than challenge. Those around Alexander noticed this shift and adapted accordingly. Generals who had once spoken freely began measuring their words carefully. Court officials developed an exquisite sensitivity to the king's moods, learning when to approach with potentially unwelcome information and when to delay. Only Callisthenes, bound by philosophical principle and a certain intellectual pride, failed to adjust his approach. The military campaign created an environment of heightened tension. Long marches through hostile territory, resistance from local populations, and the physical hardships of campaigning far from home took their toll on everyone, including Alexander. The king's legendary endurance was tested, and his responses to setbacks became more severe. Executions for perceived disloyalty or incompetence became more frequent. The atmosphere around Alexander grew heavy with fear. It was during this period that Callisthenes began to observe another troubling development. Alexander was increasingly portraying himself not merely as a king, but as a figure who transcended ordinary humanity. The adoption of Persian court customs accelerated, including practices that struck traditional Macedonians as degrading. Chief among these was proskynesis, the act of prostrating oneself before the king, a practice Greeks associated with the worship of gods, not respect for mortal rulers. When Alexander began encouraging this practice among his inner circle, many Macedonian veterans were deeply uncomfortable, but complied out of fear or pragmatic acceptance of changing circumstances. Callisthenes, however, saw this as a critical philosophical line that could not be crossed without betraying Greek principles of human dignity and proper distinction between mortals and gods. As pressure mounted for all in Alexander's circle to adopt these practices, Callisthenes found himself at a crossroads. Aristotle's warning echoed in his mind with new urgency. He understood now what his teacher had tried to tell him, that there are times when truth must yield to survival, when philosophical principle meets the immovable reality of power. Yet something in him could not make that final compromise. In private conversations with trusted friends, Callisthenes expressed growing concern about the direction of Alexander's rule. "He conquers foreign lands while being conquered by foreign customs," he observed to Ptolemy during a rare moment of candor. "He defeats Darius on the battlefield, but allows the Persian king's ghost to defeat his Greek soul." Such comments, even in private, were increasingly dangerous. Alexander's network of informants was extensive, and the king was growing paranoid about potential opposition among his officers. Several Macedonian nobles had already been executed for suspected plotting. The atmosphere at court was charged with suspicion. Yet, as tensions rose, Callisthenes continued to maintain his philosophical integrity, speaking his mind once too often during crucial moments. The campaign pressed on, and with each new territory conquered, Alexander's sense of his own invincibility and divine right grew. The man who had once engaged in intellectual debate as an equal was transforming before Callisthenes' eyes into someone who viewed himself above human criticism. The philosophical companion now stood at a precipice. Ahead lay a confrontation that would test the limits of Alexander's tolerance for truth, and the price Callisthenes was willing to pay for his principles. The confrontation that would seal Callisthenes' fate occurred during a lavish banquet in Bactra, deep in what is now Afghanistan. Alexander had arranged the feast to celebrate recent military victories and to further his policy of cultural fusion between Macedonians and Persians. The great hall was adorned with both Greek and Persian symbols, and guests included Macedonian veterans alongside newly appointed Persian nobles. Wine flowed freely, and as the evening progressed, the atmosphere grew increasingly charged with competing currents of tension and forced conviviality. Alexander, resplendent in a costume that blended Macedonian armor with Persian royal garments, sat at the center of the head table. His expression was animated, but his eyes remained watchful, assessing the reactions of his officers to the conspicuous Persian presence. It was during this feast that Alexander formally introduced the Persian custom of proskynesis to his court. This ritual prostration, falling to one's knees and touching one's forehead to the ground before the king, had long been practiced in the Persian Empire. To Persian nobles, it was a conventional show of respect to their sovereign. To Greeks and Macedonians, however, it represented something profoundly different. In Greek culture, such obeisance was reserved for the gods alone. To perform it before a mortal man suggested the elevation of that man to divine status. Alexander, who had increasingly embraced narratives of his own divine parentage since visiting the oracle at Siwa, had prepared the introduction of this custom carefully. Persian courtiers had been instructed to perform the ritual first, demonstrating the practice. Then selected Macedonians, those most loyal to Alexander and most adaptable to his new vision, would follow, providing an example for others. Callisthenes watched the proceedings with growing discomfort. He observed the subtle reactions of the Macedonian veterans, the tightening of jaw lines, the exchanged glances, the reluctant compliance of men who had once considered themselves Alexander's companions rather than his subjects. When a young Persian noble approached Alexander and performed the ritual prostration with practiced grace, Alexander acknowledged him with a pleased nod. "See how proper respect is shown in the customs of our new brethren," Alexander announced to the gathering. "As ruler of both East and West, I welcome these forms of honor that transcend the boundaries of individual traditions." Several Macedonians followed the Persian example, though with visible stiffness. Each time a veteran commander performed the prostration, something in the atmosphere of the room changed. Power was being redefined before their eyes. The relationship between Alexander and those who had fought beside him since the beginning was transforming from one of leader and followers to one of divine monarch and subjects. When it came Callisthenes' turn to approach Alexander, a hush fell over the assembly. As the court historian and philosophical representative from Aristotle himself, his actions would carry particular symbolic weight. Callisthenes walked forward with measured dignity, conscious of all eyes upon him. He stopped at the appropriate distance from Alexander and performed a respectful bow of the sort one educated Greek might offer to another, but he did not fall to his knees or touch his forehead to the ground. "I honor Alexander the king and military genius," Callisthenes said clearly enough for those nearby to hear. "But prostration is for the immortal gods, not for men, even the greatest of men." Alexander's expression froze. The silence in the hall became absolute as courtiers held their breath, waiting for the king's reaction. For a moment it seemed Alexander might overlook the implied rebuke. His face softened into what appeared to be a smile, though it did not reach his eyes. "Perhaps philosophers require special dispensation," he said with dangerous lightness. "Their knees, after all, are stiffened from long hours of contemplation." Nervous laughter rippled through the assembly. Alexander gestured for Callisthenes to take his place among the guests, and the ceremony continued. But those who knew Alexander well recognized the cold calculation that had entered his gaze. The philosopher had publicly challenged not merely a court custom, but the carefully constructed divine narrative that Alexander was establishing as the foundation of his Pan-Asian empire. In the days following the banquet, a subtle but unmistakable change occurred in Callisthenes' position at court. Where once he had been sought out for his opinions and included in Alexander's inner discussions, he now found himself increasingly marginalized. Invitations to private councils became rare. His historical accounts began to receive more critical scrutiny from Alexander's secretaries. Even those who had previously been friendly grew distant, sensing that association with the philosopher might be politically unwise. Callisthenes was not blind to these developments, but he misjudged their severity. He believed that his value to Alexander as a connection to Aristotle and Greek intellectual tradition would protect him from serious consequences. More fatally, he underestimated how thoroughly Alexander's self-conception had transformed during the years of conquest. The student who had once eagerly absorbed Aristotle's teachings about the ethical limits of power now saw himself as transcending those very limitations. The situation deteriorated further when Alexander proposed another innovation that blended Persian luxury with divine pretension. A new royal wardrobe was created that incorporated elements of attire associated with various gods in both Greek and Persian tradition. When Alexander first appeared in these garments at a public ceremony, the response was carefully orchestrated adulation from Persian attendants and uncomfortable compliance from most Macedonians. That evening, at a smaller gathering of officers and intellectuals, Callisthenes was asked directly for his opinion on the new royal presentation. Perhaps it was the wine that loosened his tongue, or perhaps it was the growing frustration at watching Alexander's transformation from philosopher-king to oriental despot. Whatever the cause, Callisthenes chose truth over caution. "I am reminded of the wisdom of Socrates," he said, "who warned that the greatest danger to any ruler is not external enemies, but the corruption of his own character. When a king dresses as a god, he risks forgetting that he is a man, with all the limitations and responsibilities that humanity entails." A dangerous silence followed. Alexander, his cheeks flushed with wine and anger, leaned forward. "And what limitations would you have me observe, philosopher?" he asked with deceptive softness. "Should the unifier of worlds concern himself with the petty constraints that bind lesser men? Even Zeus himself is bound by necessity and fate," Callisthenes replied. "The truly wise ruler acknowledges the boundaries of mortal power rather than pretending to divinity." Alexander's expression darkened, but before he could respond, one of his generals intervened with a toast to recent victories, deliberately shifting the conversation to safer ground. The moment passed, but the damage was done. Callisthenes had spoken his mind once too often on the most dangerous of subjects, Alexander's growing self-deification. Within weeks, fate provided Alexander with the perfect opportunity to move against the increasingly troublesome philosopher. A conspiracy was uncovered among certain pages, young noblemen who served as both attendants and hostages at Alexander's court. The exact nature of the plot remains historically disputed, but it centered on a youth named Hermolaus, who had been publicly humiliated by Alexander for a hunting violation and subsequently plotted revenge. During the investigation of this conspiracy, tenuous connections were established between the disaffected pages and Callisthenes. The philosopher had tutored several of them in rhetoric and ethics, and some reports suggested he had spoken critically of Alexander's more tyrannical tendencies during these lessons. Whether Callisthenes actually encouraged any plot against Alexander remains doubtful, but the association provided sufficient pretext for his arrest. The trial, such as it was, featured testimony from tortured conspirators who implicated Callisthenes as an intellectual influence, if not an active participant. Some accounts suggest that Alexander wanted a confession that would link the conspiracy all the way back to Aristotle, seeing an opportunity to break completely with his former teacher's influence. If so, he was disappointed. Under torture, Callisthenes maintained his innocence of any treasonous activity while refusing to renounce his philosophical principles regarding proper kingship. The condemned pages were executed by stoning, the traditional Macedonian punishment for treason. Callisthenes' fate was different and deliberately symbolic. According to most historical accounts, he was placed in chains, tortured over an extended period, and finally executed. Some sources say by crucifixion, others by hanging. The specific method matters less than the message Alexander intended to send. Philosophical criticism of his divine aspirations would be treated as the gravest form of treason. News of Callisthenes' execution traveled slowly back to Greece, taking months to reach Aristotle at his Lyceum in Athens. The philosopher received the news. With profound sorrow but little surprise, he had warned his nephew and student of the dangers inherent in speaking unpalatable truths to a man intoxicated by power. Now that warning had been tragically validated. In a private letter to a colleague, Aristotle reportedly wrote, "Alexander has done himself twice the injury he has done me. In killing a philosopher for speaking truth, he has not only lost a valuable mind, but proven himself unworthy of the education I provided." The breach between the philosopher and his royal student was now complete and irreparable. For Alexander, the execution of Callisthenes represented more than the elimination of a critic. It marked a definitive break with the Hellenic philosophical tradition that had shaped his youth. Increasingly, he would look to Persian and even Indian models of kingship that emphasized the monarch's separation from ordinary humanity. The man who had carried a copy of Homer's Iliad on his campaigns now surrounded himself with sycophants who reinforced his divine pretensions. The remaining Macedonian officers learned the lesson well. Those who had harbored private reservations about Alexander's orientalizing tendencies kept their concerns carefully hidden. Public discussions became exercises in elaborate praise rather than honest counsel. Even Alexander's closest friend, Hephaestion, reportedly became more careful in how he framed any disagreements with the king. The execution of Callisthenes had demonstrated that no relationship, no matter how valued, provided immunity from Alexander's wrath when his self-image was challenged. This transformation of Alexander's court culture would have profound implications for his empire. Without honest counsel to temper his ambitions, Alexander pushed his armies to ever more extreme campaigns, including the disastrous crossing of the Gedrosian desert that claimed thousands of lives. Decisions increasingly reflected Alexander's grandiose self-conception rather than strategic wisdom. While his military genius remained intact, the governance of his vast conquered territories suffered from policies driven more by personal mythology than practical statecraft. By the time Alexander reached Babylon, where he would die at the age of 32, the philosophical companion who might have helped him consolidate his conquests into a stable governance structure was long dead. Instead, Alexander was surrounded by men who competed to affirm his most extravagant visions, including plans for campaigns against Arabia and possibly Rome itself. The honest critic had been replaced by the skilled flatterer, with predictable results for the quality of decision-making. After Alexander's premature death, his empire quickly fragmented. Without the binding force of his personality, and in the absence of clear succession plans, plans that honest advisers might have insisted upon, his generals carved the conquered territories into competing kingdoms. The grand vision of a unified world under Hellenic Persian leadership dissolved into generations of warfare among the successor states. The tragedy of Callisthenes thus extends beyond his personal fate to encompass the lost potential of Alexander's empire. Had the philosopher found a way to convey necessary truths while accommodating the king's pride, the delicate balance that Aristotle had advised, history might have unfolded differently. The insight and perspective that cost Callisthenes his life might have helped Alexander transform military conquest into stable imperial structures. This historical episode echoes through time, relevant far beyond its ancient context. In every era, those with power tend to surround themselves with voices that reinforce rather than challenge their worldview. The modern workplace is no exception, where speaking truth to authority often carries professional, if not physical, risks. Corporate cultures, political organizations, and educational institutions all demonstrate the same fundamental dynamic. People in positions of power rarely welcome genuine criticism, no matter how constructively intended. Consider the executive who asks for honest feedback, but responds with cold calculation toward those who take the request at face value. Or the political leader who promotes speaking truth to power while systematically marginalizing advisors who present unwelcome facts. The mechanisms differ from Alexander's brutal approach, but the underlying psychology remains remarkably consistent across millennia. The wisdom distilled from Callisthenes' fate might be expressed as a pragmatic principle. Never be so self-absorbed as to believe that the master is interested in your honest criticism. No matter how great or virtuous a leader might appear to be, their primary interest rarely lies in hearing how they are wrong. Power creates an insulating bubble that filters out uncomfortable truths, and those who pierce that bubble often face consequences disproportionate to their perceived offense. This insight does not mean that honesty has no place in hierarchical relationships. Rather, it suggests that effective truth-telling requires strategic consideration of human psychology, particularly the psychology of power. Aristotle understood this. Callisthenes did not. The philosopher's fatal error was not in holding to his principles, but in how he expressed them, directly challenging Alexander's self-conception rather than finding ways to guide the king toward moderation while preserving his dignity. The alternative to Callisthenes' approach is not dishonest flattery, but what might be called strategic truth-telling, the careful framing of necessary criticisms in ways that can be heard without triggering defensive reactions. This requires emotional intelligence alongside intellectual rigor, understanding that how truth is conveyed often determines whether it can be received at all. For those in subordinate positions, whether employees, students, or citizens, the lesson is not to abandon integrity, but to exercise wisdom in how and when honest criticism is expressed. This might mean choosing private rather than public settings for difficult feedback. It might involve framing criticisms as questions rather than declarations. It often requires acknowledging the legitimate perspectives and pressures that shape a leader's decisions before suggesting alternatives. The next time you feel the urge to criticize your teacher or boss, think again, not to suppress truth, but to consider how that truth can be conveyed effectively. Ask yourself, is this the right moment? Have I established sufficient trust? Am I addressing the issue in a way that allows the other person to hear it without feeling threatened? In the workplace, those who master this delicate balance often prove more effective at actually influencing decisions than those who pride themselves on telling it like it is regardless of context or consequences. The goal, after all, is not merely to speak truth, but to have that truth make a difference, something that cannot happen if the messenger is dismissed or destroyed. Educational settings present similar dynamics. Students who wish to challenge their professors' perspectives are more likely to be heard if they demonstrate thorough understanding of the existing framework before proposing alternatives. The approach that begins, "I understand your position, but have you considered?" typically yields better results than the blunt contradiction that Callisthenes favored. Even in democratic societies with legal protections for free expression, the social and professional consequences of poorly timed or poorly framed criticism can be significant. Careers have been derailed and reputations damaged, not because the substance of a critique was wrong, but because its delivery ignored the human psychology of receiving criticism, particularly for those in positions of authority. Aristotle, who survived to continue his philosophical work while his student perished, understood the practical wisdom that Callisthenes lacked. His approach to influencing power was more indirect, but ultimately more effective. Through his writings and the students he continued to teach, Aristotle's ideas shaped political thought long after Alexander's empire had crumbled. The philosopher who accommodated the realities of power outlived and ultimately out-influenced the philosopher who refused such accommodation. This complex legacy offers no easy answers. There are times when direct confrontation with power is necessary despite the risks, when fundamental principles must be defended regardless of consequences. Callisthenes' stand against treating a mortal ruler as divine represents such a moment. Yet even in these instances, strategic consideration of how truth is presented may determine whether the principle being defended survives along with its defender. The wisdom arising from this ancient tragedy is neither simple courage nor simple caution, but the discernment to know when each is called for, and the skill to speak necessary truths in ways that maximize their chance of being heard. In balancing integrity with effectiveness, we honor both Callisthenes' commitment to principle and Aristotle's understanding of human nature. We recognize that the goal is not merely to speak truth, regardless of consequence, but to speak truth in ways that actually influence the world for the better. Perhaps the final lesson is that genuine influence rarely comes from direct confrontation with power, but rather through building relationships where truth can be heard because trust has been established. Callisthenes forgot that even philosophical discourse depends on human connection, on the willingness of the listener to remain open to potentially uncomfortable ideas. In focusing solely on the content of his critique while ignoring its reception, he demonstrated intellectual courage but human blindness. For those navigating modern hierarchies, the challenge remains the same: to maintain integrity while recognizing the psychology of power, to speak necessary truths without needlessly creating enemies, to balance principle with pragmatism in ways that advance genuine understanding rather than merely proving one's own righteousness. This delicate balance, rather than either uncompromising honesty or skillful flattery alone, represents the true art of influencing those with power over our fate.